And Pat Hutchings served as your vice president.
She did.
There. And she said that during your time there, you changed the way colleges and universities thought about and treated teaching in general, even beyond teacher education. What was your teaching as community property idea?
Well, the teaching as community, I think the important thing to recognize with the Carnegie Foundation is that it was 92 years old already when I became president, and we had a heritage. My predecessors included people like John Gardner and Ernest Boyer. And so it was the foundation for the advancement of teaching. That's what it was about. And what we emphasized was that the choices for faculty in higher education, and again, this was something that Boyer really began, and I think we enriched, was not between doing scholarship and doing teaching, but recognizing that they were both essential, and that at its finest, teaching was not only a form of scholarship, which was Boyer's thought, but it was an arena for doing some of the very best research on pedagogy, that members of different disciplines, be they biologists or classicists or accountants or nurses, could advance their fields most rapidly by studying the teaching and learning of their own students and the impact of their own teaching. So we created the first Advanced Study Center for teachers, which included both higher education and K-12 faculty. And we just pursued a lot of research on the scholarship of teaching and learning in that.
What about your research on the new educational doctorate at Carnegie?
Well, that was the last thing we did as I was wrapping up. We had done a 6-year study of the PhD across a number of fields. Education was one of them. And I recognized that education was utterly different from all these other fields because over 90% of the people who pursued doctorates in education never intended to pursue scholarship. They were preparing themselves for educational practice, for leadership positions generally, or curriculum positions or policy positions, but they weren't going to become academics, and yet we were training them all the same way. And so I had invited some of my colleagues, like David Berliner and Virginia Richardson, to write essays to help guide us toward the improvement of the PhD in education as a field of scholarship. But most PhDs were really preparations for practice. They were more like MDs. And yet, they were teaching people to practice by having them do doctoral dissertations, and they were just utterly mismatched. And so we began to create a notion of what we eventually called the Carnegie Project on the Education Doctorate, which was to try to encourage a prestigious, rigorous, professional practice doctorate for education. And that work is still going on. There still is a Carnegie Project. There are about 25 major doctoral institutions around the country that are part of it.
We're one of them.
And you're one of them, right? Arizona State is one of them. State of California gave this Cal State system the right to do professional practice doctorates in education. And the last I heard, about 15 of them have now joined the project. So, the goal again is not to diminish the value of the PhD. If anything, it's to elevate it by separating what you need to do to prepare people to enter the life of scholarship from what you need to do to prepare people to engage at the very highest critical levels of professional practice of education. That one size, again, doesn't fit all. So that is that work.
So given everything that you've accomplished so far through your career, what's next for you? What haven't you accomplished that you'd still like to do?
Oh, well, those are two different questions. There's so much I haven't accomplished, but I'm not going to do. One of the great virtues in having extraordinary students, and you've named some of them, is that you realize very quickly that the better you are as a teacher, the smarter your students are than you are, and the greater their capacity for do things you never could have done by yourself. And part of the joy now is having been around long enough so that my students have students. And just beginning to see, and they're doing stuff that I never could have done. They're having ideas I never would have entertained. They're criticizing my research with a kind of loving venom that makes it better. No, it's terrific. What I've begun doing now is focusing much more, kind of returning to my Jewish roots. And I'm doing more and more work on trying to create a more active and vigorous field of Jewish education. We have established at Stanford a newly endowed chair and doctoral concentration in research in the intersection of education and Jewish studies. We'll have a new endowed professor appointed, I hope, in the next few months. And I hope to be able to continue contributing to that field. And, you know, the ultimate dream is I'd love to see here at Stanford or someplace else that gets there faster, a comparative field of the study of religious education. Catholic education, evangelical education, Muslim education. I mean, more students, I'm told, are educated across the world in religious schools than in secular schools. And yet, I think my colleagues at the university find the notion of religion so toxic that they simply are disinterested in it and don't understand the enormous impact that religion and education have on one another. The effect that really good education could have to make religion a more civil part of a civil society, which it tends to be in the United States, but not in the rest of the world.
Sure.
And the impact that religion's lack of embarrassment on character development, moral development, what does it mean to lead a good life, the kind of Dalai Lama approaches to mindfulness and empathy and self-regulation, these are often missing in our approaches to teacher preparation and education. So I'd like to see these two worlds brought into contact, and not the way Judy Lanier used to describe such relationships, like two porcupines mating, but rather with more openness and respect and empathy for one another.
Really back to your roots.
Back to the roots, yeah.
At Carnegie in 1995, you also met Tom Ehrlich. Every memory he has of you since is captured with your humor. What is it with pastrami and a well-marbled life?
Well, the folks at the National Public Radio who do the This I Believe segment, I think they've just stopped doing it, but they did it once a week for years and years and years, got in touch with me and asked if I would do a This I Believe as part of All Things Considered, the morning show or whatever. And I said, well, do I get to choose my own topic? And they said, oh yeah, you choose your own topic and then we work with you. But it's got to be something you can say in 4 minutes. So the show I did came on New Year's morning, I think in 2007. It's the only thing that you can get. If you Google Shulman Pastrami, you'll get directly to this site. And I said, I believe in pastrami. And pastrami, not only as the thing in itself, but as a metaphor for a good life. And I distinguished pastrami from mere brisket, because brisket, the fat and the lean are layered. So you can very easily separate one from the other. In a really good pastrami, the lean and the fat are like they are in a really prime steak. They're marbled. They interpenetrate. And for me, the metaphor is that if there are aspects of your life, your values, your dispositions, your commitments, the way you think, the way you feel, what you believe, they shouldn't be cocooned or siloed or layered, but rather the different parts ought to be marbled, so that your values really do animate and inform your scholarship. And I think David Berliner is a lovely example of that, and he probably talked to you about that. And you do it again without permitting marbling to become corruption, and without permitting the mixture to become a kind of mess. And I thought a really good piece of pastrami captures all those values nicely. So that was...
What about your pedagogio and habitat for thought that you wanted to create for teachers?
Well, when we were trying to build the new building for the Carnegie Foundation for the Advancement of Teaching, the administration, the leadership at Stanford gave us this hilltop above the Center for Advanced Study in the Behavioral Sciences to build on. It was the site of the old Stanford dairy farm, and yet it was opposed by people who didn't want to let Stanford build on its open land anymore. And the major grounds for opposing us was that the land was a habitat for the California tiger salamander. And I certainly want to preserve the California tiger salamander, and we were really prepared to engage in any efforts needed to protect their habitat. And still, we kept on getting attacked again and again for wanting to invade the habitat of the salamander. And so I finally issued a statement in which I said, while we fully regard the importance of the salamander, we simply want to remind our critics that we're building a habitat for thought. And thought needs to be protected as well. And just as the salamander cannot flourish just anywhere, you can't pick them up and put them in Tempe, it'd be a little hot and dry for them. The notion that you should send people thinking hard about the improvement of teaching and learning to a warehouse in South San Francisco where they could do it just as easily doesn't make sense either.
Sure.
That really good thinking and good collaboration requires a setting that values and honors the importance of that kind of work.
Sure.
So we dubbed Habitat for Thought. I think Tom's reference to pedagogio is the notion that the Rockefeller Center retreat for scholars is called Bellagio, which is not in fact a Las Vegas casino, but it's a lake and a retreat center in Italy. And so I thought, well, we'll call our place Pedagogio.
Sure.
So that was what we had in mind.